have a chance to join us.
Do you have any idea how many people are registered for this?
I don't.
Maybe afterwards we can find out.
Yeah.
More than two.
Yeah, there's already more than two who've
We have a minion.
who've logged in here. Yeah, yes, we do. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And we have with us this evening, Bruce Jones of the Brookings Institution, here to talk about his informative new book, To Rule the Waves, How Control of the World's Oceans Shapes the Fate of the Superpowers. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of To Rule the Waves. Bruce is an academic and policy analyst whose work has focused on international security. He currently directs the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. He's also served with UN operations in Kosovo and the Middle East, advised the State Department and World Bank, and lectured or been a non-resident fellow at Princeton, Stanford, Yale, and New York University. His previous books have all dealt with issues of US strategy, international order, and great power relations. In To Rule the Waves, he covers a lot of ground, or should I say water. As he says in the prologue, the book is less about the oceans than it is set on the oceans, meaning the oceans are a kind of backdrop to address some of the most critical dynamics of our time, notably modern global trade, mounting tensions of naval power, and issues of climate change. As a review in the New York Journal of Books noted, Bruce's book is hard to classify. It combines history, geography, business case studies, and strategic analysis. But whether he's writing about the proliferation of shipping containers, the expansion of powerful navies, the laying of undersea cables, the need for oceanic energy production, or the effects of climate change, Bruce makes clear why the oceans are and will remain a central arena of competition among the world's powers. Now, in conversation with Bruce will be Evan Osnos, very talented staff writer at the New Yorker and also author of several books, who seems almost to moonlight as either a featured author or moderator at PNP events. Evan was just with us last week to talk about his new book, Wildland, an excellent examination of how polarized and yet connected Americans are. But before Bruce and Evan begin, we have another guest, Suzanne Maloney, who has Bruce's previous job at Brookings, Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program there. And she'd like to say a few words. So Suzanne, take it away.
Thanks so much, Brad, and thanks so much to Politics and Prose for hosting this book launch for my colleagues Brooke. It is really my great pleasure to welcome all of you and to join Brad and Politics and Prose in welcoming you to this very special event, launching the book To Rule the Waves, How Control of the World's Oceans Shape the Fate of the Superpowers. This is an important new book that was just released last week, and it offers timely analysis and commentary on the critical role that the oceans play in the struggle for political and economic power. In his book, Bruce Jones takes us on a journey to examine the maritime components of global commerce and how the oceans factor into military dominance. From a submarine base in the Arctic Circle in Norway, to traveling on a container ship for 10 days across the world's most contested waters in the Western Pacific, including the South and East China Seas, Bruce transports readers and provides a lens through which we can understand the geopolitics of globalization. Examining how the seas shape the world around us, Bruce outlines 4 factors that organized his research. 1, how the oceans are fast becoming the front lines for military contestation among the great powers. 2, that more than 85% of global commerce is a function of sea-based trade. 3, that the oceans are vital to communication. More than 90% of global data flows through undersea cables. And 4, that oceans play a critical role in energy and climate change. Most importantly, Bruce's book presents an illuminating account of how our security, prosperity, and environment are inextricably linked to the world's oceans, and he offers sound ideas on how the US can chart a way forward. I'm also delighted that Evan Osnos, who's a colleague of ours at Brookings as a non-resident senior fellow, will be joining to moderate our discussion tonight. As you know, Evan is a staff writer at The New Yorker and also a recently published author, so we're really thrilled to have him conducting this conversation. Bruce, congratulations on this important new book. We're really looking forward to hearing your insights. Before I turn the mic over to Evan, I will queue up a video that will provide an overview of some of the themes in this terrific new book. Thank you, everyone.
It's how most of us get our crucial goods and sustain our ways of life. In a matter of a few short decades, China has far outstripped every other country as a source for sea-based trade. Shanghai, the world's largest trading hub, moved 42 million shipping containers last year, almost 6 times more than its largest American competitor. The Singapore Strait has displaced the Suez Canal as the world's most important shipping lane. It's not just commercial trade that relies on the oceans. Almost 3/4 of the world's supply of oil and gas is found at sea or moved by sea to its final market. Data, too. Fully 93% of the data that powers the internet, social media, and global finance moves through undersea cables that line the ocean floor. American internationalism was born at sea, and U.S. naval dominance has long been a crucial feature of American power and leadership. Along with being critically important for trade and energy, oceans are also a literal weather vane of our changing climate and the locale of some of the most important climate science. There's a great deal to gain and a lot to lose on the world's oceans. For now, the US has the only Navy capable of projecting power across the high seas. But China is moving swiftly to compete, and in some domains, like anti-ship missile technology, it has outpaced America. Russia has revived some parts of its naval might. Japan is unshackling its powerful navy. India is positioning itself to compete, and Britain is trying to restore some of its former reach. All of this amounts to an ongoing global naval arms race, pitting the world's top military and economic powers in a tense rivalry. In To Rule the Waves, I take you on a journey from Shanghai to Pearl Harbor, from the Arctic to the Southern Ocean, by way of ports and bases and pirates, to help illustrate how the struggle for command of the high seas is shaping our prosperity, our security, and our environment.
Thank you to Bruce, most of all. But first, I got to say, Bruce, I want to thank our hosts this evening. We are very fortunate to be with Politics in Prose tonight, celebrating, as they so often do, an important new book. And thank you to Suzanne for setting us off here on our journey, a relevant metaphor for this book. And I have to tell you, Bruce, you know, you and I, as colleagues at Brookings and as friends, I have known you as, of course, an important thinker on subjects like great power competition and multilateralism. And the great joy and thrill is to discover also what a vibrant storyteller you are. And I have had just a wonderful time in the reading of this book in manuscript. You and I talked about it before you'd actually finished writing, and to see it now finished is a thrill, because it really is a tale, a chronicle of the journey that you've covered. And I think that's important because it stitches together pieces that Americans may not yet immediately understand. 2 things to mention at the outset. For people who are joining us, don't take it from me, take it from Mike McFall, who says that this, both as writing and as analysis, this book, To Rule the Waves, is a masterpiece. And I think he is absolutely right. It's lucid, it's illuminating, and it helps you understand things that I think for many are abstract. And if anybody is wondering about the relevance of a subject of maritime competition, look no further than the front page of the newspaper this week, or turn on the TV. Bruce has been all over the place talking about and writing about what is, and what he describes rightly, is the latest turn in an absorbing reality of our time, an ongoing and escalating global naval arms race. So this period that we are now contending with, made vivid with the US, Australia, UK submarine deal, all of it under the context of how we will organize the Pacific over the next century, brings us to the doorstep of this journey. And I want to begin, if I can, Bruce, with where you begin, which is that you start us off not on the very first page, but about 15 pages or so in. You take us up, and I'm going to massacre the pronunciation here, to the Olafsvern Naval Base. Did I get that about right?
Pretty close.
All right. And as you describe it, it's a once secret submarine facility in Norway. And you help us frame out the great geopolitical struggles of our time, the military power struggle, economic dominance, and our changing climate. And in some ways, these become the tides that move this book along. But why start the tale there? Why that place?
Well, first of all, before I jump in, a huge thank you to you for doing this, and to Brad and Suzanne for co-hosting this, Politics and Prose at Brookings. I'm enormously grateful. And Evan, I'm just enormously grateful to you for taking a little bit of time out of your week. You've got one or two other books to talk about this week, so I'm very happy to be with you here. And you did help me early on in my thinking about how to tell this story. How to go on this journey. So Olafsvern Naval Base, this is an astonishing place. All right, we're 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and you go down this steep fjord. You sail down this fjord, this very steep walled fjord, and there are these giant mountains on top of you. It's the Norwegian Alps, and this very small opening at the side of a mountain. You drive into this dark, long tunnel. You're underneath the mountain. And you turn a corner, and what's in front of you is this vast naval base, literally carved out of the heart of a mountain. It's like walking onto the set of a James Bond movie, right? So partly I wanted to start the book there because it has a nice drama to it, and I wanted to tell the readers that I was going to help try to visualize some of these themes. I'm somebody who learns from seeing, and sort of to visualize these themes in a way we sometimes don't. But more importantly, I start the book in the Arctic because I do think it illustrates several of the themes that the book is trying to touch on, not necessarily in this order, but we see in the Arctic this increasing pace of the melt of the Arctic ice cap is one of the most worrying bellwethers of our changing climate. But it's also a place where you can see that a changing climate, contrary to conventional wisdom, is creating both winners and losers and stoking competition. We see in the adjacent Norwegian and the Barents Sea some of the most advanced and complex offshore energy exploration, and it's a way, including some of the largest gas finds of recent years. And it helps to seed a theme which comes later in the book about the absolutely fundamental role that oceans now play in both the discovery and the flow of oil and gas and in global energy markets. We're watching in real time as the fabled northern route across the polar ice cap that the Royal Navy searched for a half century now exists and is rapidly becoming a viable sea-based trade route, a development that over time may be as significant as the opening of the Suez Canal. And we see that all of this is adding to geopolitical tension. During the Cold War, Olafsvern was the NATO's northernmost facility for keeping an eye on the Soviets. And then in the calmer years of the post-Cold War, it was actually sold off. It was closed down as a base. It was sold into private hands. It was used to sort of store pleasure boats and stuff. And now guess what? It's being refurbished and retooled and reopened as a naval base. The United States has signed a new status of forces agreement. And once again, we have US nuclear submarines in the high Arctic, keeping a close eye on the Russians and the Chinese. And so it's one locale where we can illustrate several of the major themes. The most important, I think, being this notion that the nature of contemporary globalization, far from the way we often talk about it as kind of ballast against tensions, is actually a central driver of what I think is the most dangerous feature of contemporary geopolitics, namely this active and amplifying global naval arms race, which reaches far beyond the South China Sea, which is where we often hear about it most, and out to the farther reaches of the world's oceans, the Arctic included.
And that is, in some sense, one of the things that opened my eyes in this book, was getting outside of the mindset of just thinking about the South China Sea and the Pacific. And you've really put us on a global scale. I'm curious, as an author, I'm interested in how you came to this book. we're going to talk in a lot more detail about some of the themes you just mentioned. But why this book, Bruce? Was this something that you've always been interested in, or did you have a moment, a sort of germination of your curiosity here? Because the curiosity comes through in the pages.
It was a little bit both. I was struggling. I was watching these changes in geopolitics. I was watching changes and was working on climate change. I'd done some work in the Arctic. I was looking for a way I could see these interconnections, but I wanted to understand them more, and I wanted to be able to talk about them without spending my entire time citing IMF reports and the like. I began noticing that everywhere I went, I was working on something related to the oceans. I spent a lot of time advising the UN and working with the UN on their counter-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean. Obviously in DC, we spent a lot of time talking about the South China Sea and China's Navy, in the Arctic, as we just discussed. And it sort of began to dawn on me that I was spending a lot of time thinking about the oceans. And then I write about it in the book. I mean, the place where it actually came together was the strangest thing. I was, of all places, I was in the middle of the Amazonian rainforest, 1,500 miles in every direction from the nearest ocean. And I was on an educational holiday with my family. And we went out onto the Amazon River, this amazing part of the Amazon near Manaus. And what do I see sailing up the river? But this cargo ship loaded with containers from Maersk, and I knew Maersk as a company. I spent part of my childhood in Copenhagen. And so it sort of came together for me, this sense of quite how important sea-based trade was to globalization and the rise of the new powers. And a lot of dots just sort of began to fall in line. And that was sort of the germ of the book in its current form.
And then you had to begin to decide which register you were going to write in. As you say, there is the sort of IMF white paper register.
Right.
But in fact, one of the things you've done here is that you've combined different disciplines in a way that works. Like there's a lot of science in the fun way in here that I described it at one point to somebody as sapiens for the seas. I mean, I do think there is something to this, that you're clearly interested in how ocean science runs through some of the larger thematic and geopolitical issues you're describing, and historically. Can you talk a bit about that? Why was it important for you to understand some of the science?
Yeah, so I was really struck by this. I actually say this in the book, that sort of everywhere I turned, I discovered these huge sort of fields of history and science that I was only glancingly aware of. But perhaps the place I was most unaware was the ocean sciences. And to go back and discover, we all know the HMS Beagle and the HMS Challenger, these kind of famous ocean science voyages of the Royal Navy. But I didn't know, and I think a lot of people have forgotten or have never known, that the largest, most expansive ocean sciences expedition of the 18th century was not, the 19th century was not the British, it was the United States. It was the United States exploring expedition, the USXX, did the first charting of what we now call the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic. Sailed most of the world's seas, collected a vast store of research, which founded this collection, which is now the Smithsonian. And then it's sort of at various key points in American history, the ocean sciences proved to be extremely important in sort of how we became an international actor. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Navy was the largest sponsor of science in the US government and seeded a series of experiments. Much of what we know today about climate change can trace its roots back to the ocean sciences sponsored by the US Navy, this vast complex of oceanic science and atmospheric science institutes that we have as a nation, a huge asset, which we never talk about and has very little visibility unless you're in that community. So I was fascinated by it, and I spent a lot of time, reminding myself of some basic chemistry, which I'd forgotten, and other things. It's an extraordinarily rich science. I just obviously touched the surface of it in the book, but at least try to portray how it connects to these other fields.
I want to mention at this point to remind people to go ahead and begin to start putting your questions into the Q&A. We're going to get to those later. But the more we talk, the more it will begin to give people queries that we'll make sure we leave time for. I have a lot of things I want to ask about. I want to talk about globalization, which you nodded to earlier, because we're at an interesting moment in the kind of conversation about globalization or globalism, because it can feel as if the pandemic was, in some sense, a referendum on either the durability or the fragility of our interconnections. And you make an interesting point, almost a sort of provocative point about globalization. You challenge the notion that it is new. And you also say it's important for us to understand its history. Talk a bit about what role you, or how you came to think about globalization over the course of this work.
So I guess I think about it as sort of two different parts of the book and in two different phases of our own history. So first, at the early parts of the book, I do spend some time tracing the history of the economic interconnections between the East and the West, right? Initially, it's the Islamic world in the Indian Ocean and Europe as it begins to reach past its own sort of land boundaries. So ironically, it's the Portuguese, the westernmost country in Europe, that finds the trade routes, the trade winds around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. Ironically, or sort of in one of those historical moments, precisely at the moment when the Chinese, having begun for the first time to explore sea power, pull it back. And so the Europeans find an Indian Ocean that's not encumbered by Chinese sea power. And you watch the development of British, sort of Portuguese and Dutch, and then most importantly, British imperial power, and the crucial role that navies play in forging that, but also then the way that that interaction shapes what we talk about as globalization. I was interested, we know something, I think, about the Opium Wars, where the UK, both the English East India Company and the Royal Navy sort of forced open the Chinese market, forced them over to free trade and the sale of opium. That was accomplished by the Royal Navy and formalized in two treaties, the Treaty of Nanking and the Treaty of the Bogue. And when you read those treaties, it is literally the same language that we now use in the WTO and the GATT, sort of most favored nation, and all the provisions. They're there from those treaties of the 1850s. And the routes that were forged and the legal arrangements that were forged lay the foundation for contemporary globalization. Then the second phase is really all about the emergence of bulk shipping in the last several decades. And what I trace there is the rise of bulk shipping in both senses of that term. First as a transatlantic trade, then expanding out to the Pacific with Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, when Hong Kong was part of the West. And then this shift with the return of Hong Kong to China, with China's opening to the global economy, and then this just astonishing pace of rise of global trade, one for one at a pace with this rise in the scale of containerized trade and bulk shipping. And what I began to understand is it literally was bulk shipping, containerized shipping and bulk shipping of raw materials that enabled China's rise in the global economy. They are inseparable phenomena.
And everybody is sort of thinking about shipping these days because of the shortages, supply chain. I am just curious. I mean, you've seen the stories about the sudden surge in container prices. Is this the sort of thing that people should be prepared for more? I mean, we see it now. We sort of associated with the pandemic, the idea that our supply chain is a little more tenuous than we might have assumed. Is one of the things that you've concluded that actually this is a feature of the globalized life?
Look, that's an important question, but I'll come to it a little bit adversely. I'm struck watching this last year. As you said, the pandemic was a kind of forcing event for realization of the fragility of supply chains and our exposure to this stuff. And you heard a lot more people talking about deglobalization and delinkage. And what happened? We all sat at home on our computers and ordered stuff from Amazon. The other end was produced in Asia and put on container ships and sailed to the United States. And the volumes of trade grew, sea-based trade grew hugely last year. While we were talking about deglobalization, what we were doing was diving deeper into globalization. And one of the things I wanted to try to do in the book was try just to use those images. I take the readers to the port of New York, and we can see all the goods that come in through that port, everything that we buy, everything that we eat. And just to show quite how deeply the US economy is in fact torqued around the beam of sea-based globalization, meaning that if we do in fact want to deglobalize, we're going to be unwinding 60 years of the way we have remade global trade and at vast cost.
I want to talk about we're gonna get back to the naval question in a moment, but I want to talk, since we're talking about trade for a second. You take us at one point in the book to the Yangshan port in Shanghai, And you describe just this extraordinary expansion, and the scale, I think, is hard for people to capture if they haven't really lingered on it. And one of the things you've done is help us kind of visualize it and the effect, and over time also the effect on European and American ports. But what does Yangshan tell us, really? What is it? What is it a window into the future of China and also the future of the rest of the world?
Yeah, so this is essentially Shanghai's port, but it's a couple hours down the highway south from Shanghai, and then over what was the longest sea bridge in the world until China built another that's now the longest sea bridge in the world. This is a phenomenal feat of engineering, this bridge. And you come to what was once a small island, but through land reclamation has turned into vastly the largest container port in the world. Not to illustrate for a second, but to illuminate, I think in 2019, last year before these statistics were a little bit skewed by the pandemic, the port of Long Beach, Los Angeles, which is the largest in the US, did 8 million container drops. That's moving containers on or off ships in that year. Shanghai did 42 million. Okay, so it's 6 times larger than its nearest Western competitor. And when you look at the kind of league tables of global ports, go back 40 years, and it's New York, it's Rotterdam, and it's London, and et cetera. And then some of the kind of Westernization countries show up, Korea, Japan, et cetera. Fast forward to present day, and not only is Shanghai atop the league tables, the next 5 largest ports in the world are all Chinese, and there is no American port left in the top 10 in the world. And I think it just sort of puts an exclamation point on how absolutely central Chinese production is to everything that is consumed globally, right? We live in a world of global just-in-time production, and Chinese production and combination of goods is integrated to every aspect of that. In the past, trade has been, as to use a social science term, a lagging indicator of power, a leading indicator of power, right? When you become one of the largest trading nations in the world, what tends to happen is that naval power follows. And that's very much what we're seeing in the Chinese case. So it's simply we all know how big China is as an economy, but when you see it in trade terms, it's so much bigger than everything else. It's a stark fact, I think.
I want to anticipate a question somebody will ask us in Q&A, which is, how has that level of traffic and interconnection been affected by the trade pressures that were first introduced during the Trump administration? What's the impact?
Barely at all, actually. It's interesting. I mean, there has been really very little impact on that at all. There might be, I shouldn't say none. I mean, there may be some in the kind of soy trade and things like that, where you have bulk shipping of agricultural goods, but certainly not in the commercial goods sector, not really at all.
And what does that tell you about the patterns? Meaning, that, because that was an earnest effort on the part to try to choke off some of those flows, and it didn't work.
I use the image at the back. This is again going back to my sort of childhood in Copenhagen. There's a Danish story about King Canute, who was a mythical king of Denmark, who went with his retinue and kneeled down in the surf to try to hold back the tides. And for me, it was very much the image of what we were trying to do with the tariffs. This kind of fantastic weight of the tidal wave of globalization, and sort of sitting in the surf trying to hold back the tide while it's actually crashing over us. I don't think we did much to change the patterns of globalization.
When you think about what people talk, the people will talk about the idea of unwinding those linkages in a sort of broad-based way, decoupling in some form or another. We have to forgive the shorthand.
Yeah.
Based on the work that you've done and the degree to which you've absorbed yourself in this material, do you look at that and say that is a fantasy? Do you say that is possible to coexist alongside? How do you imagine that prospect?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I give a good answer to that in the book. What I do say is that we're going to have to start coming to terms with a series of fundamental tensions. Among them is that we are deeply torqued around that beam, and yet that's an increasing tension with the geopolitical dynamics that it's creating. And we'll come to the naval question. We'll see how, in fact, it was sea-based globalization played a key role in driving those geopolitical tensions. And we're going to have to reconcile that at some stage, as we are this kind of, I think, thorny question of the fact that it's our Navy that plays the key role in protecting global trade and protecting it for rich allies and even richer competitors. And that's going to I don't know how long that can hold. What I do want to emphasize is that any project of unmaking globalization in those terms is going to be fantastically expensive. It's not a kind of a minor project, right? This is absolutely central to what the American economy is in the contemporary world.
To that point, you make an interesting point in the book, which is that you say that the rise of containerization, the emergence of global supply chains, has shifted American influence in the global sphere. And I think American influence is something you want to talk about. You make the point that America's modern role in global finance created, this is your writing, a key imbalance, one that pits globalized economics against America's international security roles. Talk a bit more about that, if you would.
Yeah, so it goes back to the very founding of the American Navy, which was actually born in an effort to tackle piracy against American shipping in the Mediterranean and then in the Atlantic. And from that period on, we've had as a kind of central part of our thinking about our Navy, that's one of its roles. I mean, the British had this role in the 18th and 19th century, and we've taken on this role as the guarantor of freedom of navigation, the guarantor of freedom of seas, the guarantor of freedom of energy flows on the high seas. The Navy uses this horrible acronym, FONOPS, Freedom of Navigation Operations. It literally means sailing American ships around in ways that stop people from choking off sea lanes, right? But there is a pretty substantial irony if one of the things that we are doing with the Navy is securing the flow of goods in and out of Chinese ports in a way that has given rise to Chinese economic power and increasingly to Chinese military power. And so I just think there are some contradictions there that we're going to have to start to grapple with in a different way than we have.
When you hear the debates that are happening, this is another question about America's Navy. When you hear the debates in Washington about the relative size of our Navy compared to China's expansion, what do you make of those? Where do you feel as if the United States has taken its foot off the gas? Do you feel as if we're doing the right thing? How does that land with you?
I'm going to answer a slightly different question than you asked, but it's germane to the answer, okay? Because for me, what was really striking about the research I did and the trips that I took and some of the experiences I had doing the book was to understand how totally enmeshed modern naval power is with wider questions of technology. Okay, I think when you think about naval combat, we still have an image of sort of a British frigate shooting at a French frigate in the Indian Ocean or something, but that's not at all what we're talking about anymore. These are, the modern Navy is totally integrated into an extraordinarily complex system of land, sea, air, space, radar, development of vast information and mapping systems by which we track the world's navies, and increasingly they track us. So when I hear people talk about the number of boats we have or the number of ships we have, it's really not at all the right metric. What we need to be looking at is whether we have the right combination of naval and technological assets to sustain the missions that we want to sustain, which are being eroded very rapidly by Chinese capability. But it was one of the reasons why I was sort of quite impressed by what the administration did recently with the Australians and the UK. As I think the US has three choices in the Western Pacific. It can look at the huge rise of the Chinese Navy and say, all right, well, we're out. I think they would come with a huge loss of influence in both economic and strategic terms. Or we can go sort of mano a mano against the Chinese Navy, which has a kind of incredible pace of shipbuilding. Or we can retool our alliances to add other people's ships to our ships in the effort to deal with the Chinese challenge. And we've been doing that. Didn't get a lot of notice, but a couple of years ago, we signed a trilateral agreement with Japan, the UK, and Australia. Japan, the UK, and the US. Japan still has a pretty powerful Navy, actually. We don't hear about it much. We don't think about it much, but it does. And you start putting together the Japanese Navy, our Navy, the Australian Navy, the UK, and you start to have a serious sort of wall that can constrain Chinese ambition.
And do you think that it will constrain Chinese ambition?
Well, it's an arms race. I use that phrase deliberately. It is a race. The Chinese are building ships at a fierce pace. They are innovating in anti-ship technology at a fierce pace. We are keeping pace, but only just. Adding in our allies is a huge, huge asset. I spent some time in the book looking at what this really means. It's complicated and it's dangerous. We're talking about submarine to submarine warfare. We're talking about nuclear barrages at sea in an extreme scenario. We're talking about blockading Chinese ports. We're talking about very large scale warring systems, right? Again, I try to communicate, we're not talking about a couple of ships in the middle of the ocean firing cannons at one another. This is large scale warfare. The Chinese call it informatized warfare. We call it systems warfare. We have any number of acronyms that go along with the way we think about this. But this would pit a major part of our military and technological power against the Chinese at a distance of 7,000 miles from our shore, by the way, which is a non-trivial factor here.
I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are tuning in tonight because they're interested in this question of the arms race between the U.S. and China. I want to, if you can, bring us to another location that you visited, because you have this extraordinary experience now of having gone into essentially the engine room of these conflicts, and at least of these tensions, I should say, and I want to be more precise about it. One of the places you bring us to is the USS John Paul Jones, which is a guided missile destroyer. Why there? What does it tell us? And what's it like, honestly, for people who haven't been there? What is it actually like?
Yeah, this was another very dramatic sort of visit for me, to go on to the destroyer. It's an older ship, but it's the most advanced ship in the American fleet now, primarily because of its software, which is, again, a revelation for me. You would think about a ship being a hardware, but it's software that really powers the John Paul Jones. And, in days of yore, you would go onto the bridge and you'd be sort of commanding a ship from a bridge and you'd be smelling the ocean air and hearing cannon fire. That is not how it works nowadays. You go down into the very heart of the ship and into what's called a combat information center. The CIC is this room painted entirely black to absorb the heat from the vast computing power. I have about 40 computing stations where people are tracking radar and mapping and weapon systems. You can fire Tomahawk missiles, you can fire anti-ship missiles, you can fire all sorts of kinds of weapon systems. The world's most powerful software is organizing all of that effort, linked up to satellites and land-based stations. So it is this astonishingly high-tech experience to be inside this boat. At the same time, I write about it in the book, so tradition dies hard, right? So naval officers always used to like writing their calculations on a glass screen, but now you can't because everything's by computer. But they would just scribble it on their screens. But then the Navy spent, I think, $50 million to upgrade the screens to touch screens. And so you can't do that anymore. So they all went off and they bought these $50 sort of plastic visors to put over their screens so they could still do their hand calculations. So you have, billions of dollars worth of software sort of coursing through the wires in this combat information center, and officers still scribbling hand calculations, right? And there's this juxtaposition between the kind of long tradition of naval warfare and the modern reality of this extraordinary network of systems of information that constitute the modern reality of naval combat.
It is a theme, actually, that I one of the things that sort of bubbles at the surface of the book that is fun is this combination of the durable and the modern. And there are ways in which the way of the seas today is not all that different than it was a few hundred years ago. And then you have these entirely modern elements, and there's sort of a tension there, which is fascinating. I mean, part of what the appeal of this is that you're plunged into the world, a vocabulary. It's a language of its own. There are rules, there are norms, mores. A question, if we can, actually, about I do want to linger for a second on the naval arms race. We're going to turn to the questions in just a moment. But I think there are people who wonder, are we paying the right amount of attention to the South China Sea? Are we paying more attention than we should? Is it under described? How do you rate that?
Well, there's been a huge amount of attention specifically to the South China Sea, and lots of people in this town devoting a lot of time and effort to it. One of the things I want to try to do with the book is pull our gaze past it, right? Yeah. First of all, it's 3 seas on China's adjacent shore: the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, and in between them, very, very, very importantly, the Taiwan Strait, which is kind of a part of this story. But then out through the Luzon Strait, which connects the eastern reaches of those waters and the Philippine Sea out into the broader Western Pacific. And the presence now of a very active race for, I don't think the Chinese really at this stage are challenging for dominance, but certainly for counter dominance in the Indian Ocean, in the wider reaches of the Pacific, in the Arctic, via the Arctic down into the northern reaches of the Atlantic. So the South China Sea is important in how this starts. It's critically important in the context of Taiwan.
Yeah.
But in no way is China's naval ambition limited to those waters. There is debate about this, but having spent a lot of time reading the work of people much more knowledgeable than I am about Chinese Navy development and the thinking inside and talking to a lot of people here, I come down squarely on the conclusion that they clearly have an ambition to develop a global blue water navy. There's a perfect logic for them to do so. Every other aspirant to global power has done so. They have vast stakes in the protection of sea-based trade and oil and gas. They don't want to have to rely on us to do that. And it's kind of a story of a very classic, and in the end, it's kind of a tragic security dilemma between us and them, which leads them to have this much more expansive reach, with some nuance, by the way, between what was animating that in the period pre-Xi Jinping and the contemporary period, where I think the ambition changes and the nature of the presence changes. So the South China Sea is an important flashpoint, but it would be a huge mistake to understand this as limited to those waters. This is now a global naval struggle with many other navies participating, by the way. The Russians, the Indians, the Japanese, the Europeans are sort of edging back in, the Australians, as we've seen. This is not limited to just the United States and China. This is encompassing every major economic and military power in the world.
Why are they all joining that race to some degree?
It seems to me that if you realize that 50% of the world's global economy operates on the boundaries of those waters, and you have every major economy in the world tied into sea-based globalization, every major economy in the world tied into the flow of global flow of oil and gas. Every state that has influence wants a seat at that table, right? They want to be part of that story. Look at the French seeking to deepen their engagement in the Indo-Pacific. The British have recommissioned their new aircraft carrier and sailed it. Where did they sail it first? Through the Luzon Strait. Right. That is the center of the world economy. It is now the kind of the front lines of geopolitical tension. And if you're a major player like India, you want a seat at that table. You want a chip in that game, and you have your own insecurities as well. I mean, the Indians and the Japanese in particular have deep insecurities about what a more expansive and more powerful Chinese Navy can do.
I would be delinquent if we don't devote some time to climate. And it's a serious piece of your framing and how you think about this. I think one of the most valuable things this book does is helps us also try to anticipate the world to come. We are just a few weeks away from 196 countries in Glasgow, COP26, to discuss climate action. Based on everything you've gathered in the course of this, Bruce, I'm curious how you think about this balance between mitigation and adaptation. I find myself thinking about this a lot these days in all kinds of terms, both political, personal, just imagining the future that we will inhabit. How do you see the US wrestling with this question of adaptation, and are we doing it right?
So first, I would say it would be, want to be on record and being among those who would want to see us being very ambitious on mitigation. But, if the whole world stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, which it won't and it can't, we have already baked in huge quantities of heat into the system. What was so revealing for me in doing the work on the oceans was how much it is the case that the oceans are what mediate between us putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere and then coming sort of back into our weather systems via the oceans. That's something we understand by way of the ocean sciences that I talked about earlier in these kind of critical experiments the US Navy had done. So irrespective of what we do now on the mitigation side, we're going to be dealing with a lot of adaptation. And towards the end of the book, I take the reader, I had to do it via Zoom because by now we were in the middle of COVID. but I take the readers to Burma, to Myanmar, to the Bay of Bengal, which is the place where you can watch this most advanced. We can track pretty well changes in weather patterns in one part of the world and how it's playing out in sea level rise and monsoon season, and with hugely negative consequences. Displacing hundreds of thousands of people and devastating agricultural production. All right, so these are low-lying countries. They're at the front edge of the product of the. So for the rest of us, quite how fast, quite how bad remains to be seen. One little point though, which is that in that world, marine engineering is going to become a hugely consequential piece of the economy. And the place in the world that is best at marine engineering is Houston, Texas. Right. And so I make it, it's partly a political point for me that sometimes when we talk about globalization, it becomes a story of the East and the West Coast. But in fact, all sorts of parts of the American polity have things to offer in a world of globalization and changing climate and climate adaptation. So I point to that in the book as well.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to questions now, and folks can continue to add them. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Already a number of people have written in. I'll ask a question posed by Frederick Drake. He asked, it would seem to me that the undersea telecommunication cables are very vulnerable to attack, either from a non-state actor like a terrorist group or a nation state adversary. How do we protect against this if we do? And what has prevented such an attack so far?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And to be honest, one I only began to understand and perceive, and I still have more work to do to understand the dynamics of this. 93% of all the data in the world, when we're using our smartphones, when we're on Zoom meetings, when we're online banking, when we're shopping, when the US military is sending instructions around the world, 93% of that data flows through these undersea cables, okay? I described them in a recent piece as the largest and most vulnerable network of globalization. So the question goes to the right thing. I don't know of any non-state group that has anything like the capability to disrupt them. We can disrupt them and have capacities to protect them. The Russians can disrupt them. The Chinese can disrupt them, and probably a few other navies as well. We've been watching very carefully as Russian submarines have spent quite a lot of time on the ocean floor, lingering around some key hubs of these cables. That can be for tapping them. It could be for disrupting them. I worry that this is a place we have underinvested. We no longer have anything like the capability we used to have for protection and laying new cable lines. It's also, by the way, a fascinating world in which you might sort of initially think, well, this must all be states, but Google and Microsoft just laid the world's fastest undersea cable from here to Asia, because of course they have a vast stake in high-speed data flows. Who controls that cable, right? I mean, all sorts of interesting questions emerge about the relationship between corporate power and state power. And whether or not how we're going to protect these things. Now, one thing to say is, so for example, if the Chinese make a military move on Taiwan, which is in first and foremost a naval move, one of the things that they can do is they can cut the cables to Taiwan, which would be hugely disruptive. But all this stuff is complicated because, of course, you can't just snip one part of that network without disrupting large parts of it. And just as we're torqued around the beam of sea-based trade and globalization and data flows, vastly so are they. And so I do think that it is an important dynamic that, going back to the South China Sea for a second, when we started to see Chinese naval build up, one of the things that people in Washington say is, oh, they could choke off the trade. They can't choke off the trade. Their whole economy is dependent on the flow of goods through those waters. They cannot possibly choke off that trade. And even as we've seen them build up substantial power, they haven't disrupted trade. They can't. So they're equally dependent on that trade. And in that one sense, it is a stabilizer. In the other senses, I mean, of course, it's been a driver of real tensions.
Yeah, which is actually, there's a relevant question here, a really interesting point that you were making. There is a question here about whether an arms race, as we've been talking about, is the best framework for analyzing the strategic game. In the case of nuclear arms, key factors are deterrence and mutually assured destruction. What would be the corresponding elements in the world of shipbuilding?
Well, it's not in shipbuilding that I use the concept of an arms race. It's in our naval buildup, the Chinese naval buildup and our naval buildup, and the corresponding buildup of several other navies. Look, I mean, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race wasn't the only arms race we've ever experienced. We've experienced lots of other arms races, including naval arms races. A big part of how we got into World War I was the British looking at German naval buildup and saying to themselves, a very famous exchange within the British Foreign Ministry that I write about in the book, where one of the quote experts in the British Foreign Ministry looks at the German naval buildup and says, look, it's probably mostly commercial, right? It's probably mostly about them wanting a larger role in protecting global commerce. But how do we know?
Yeah.
And it's exactly what's happened between us and the Chinese, where there is a logic to say, look, a big part of their naval buildup is about their stakes in sea-based trade. But how do we know? And how do we know over time? And it can change over time. And we are building new boats, commissioning new boats, investing in new technologies, new missile systems. They're doing the same. We counter, they counter, and it is an arms race in those terms. And as I say, it's also pulled in several other navies around the world.
Relevant to that, somebody else asks, they say they've read articles about the possibility of war between the US and China. And they've read that the US can't win a war in or near the South China Sea, or I might, anyway, well, this is the question as asked, meaning that the US wouldn't be in a position to stop a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Do you agree with that assessment?
I will say this, that in a lot of the war gaming that I've been sort of privy to over the last couple of years, you can run those war games in a way where we lose that war. Yeah. It's a big part of this phase of our buildup in the Western Pacific. We're moving a lot more equipment out there, Marines, missile systems, other kinds of things. The way the Chinese talk about this is, they use the term counterinsurgency, that if we were to try to reinforce our presence in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, it depends a little bit on how far we would go. You know, a lot of their capacity is built around these reclaimed islands in the South and East China Sea. Michael Hanlon, our colleague, has described them as stationary aircraft carriers. You know, it's pretty clear that we could take them out in the first day of a conflict. What's very striking to me as I play out these scenarios, going back to this point that the Navy is totally integrated into this system of radar and tracking and information flows. A lot of that stuff is, and of anti-ship missile systems, a lot of that stuff is inland in China, and up to 1,000 miles inland. And in any escalatory scenario, we very quickly get to a point where the US Air Force and the Naval Air Force launching off aircraft carriers is hitting targets deep inland, deep inland mainland China. This is not, again, it's not a, you know, this is not a couple of boats exchanging gunfire at sea. This is us using naval and air power to hit Chinese targets on land with, you can imagine what the consequences are.
Yeah.
The broader question, of course, is what does it mean to win that war? Can we succeed in reversing an attack on Taiwan? Maybe. I spent a lot of my time thinking about the farther reaches of Chinese power, because of course the dilemma for them, it seems to me, is the farther out they go in their ambition and their scope, the less they have the advantage of geography and the weaker their naval capacity is relative to ours. And I think we have to be spending a lot more time thinking about how we can complicate China's life and some of its farther reaches, even in the context of escalating tensions with Taiwan.
We've got a few questions that are circling around some related issues, so I'll sort of condense them and combine them for a moment. One of the questions that somebody asked is, if you can, just give us a sense of the ratio of things like between the US and China. Give us on whatever scale or whatever level of synthesis you want. How do the two stack up when it comes to things like nuclear submarines, fighter planes?
So, you know, we're still much larger, right? We're still a much larger Navy. We have many more, well, by the way, in terms of power, not necessarily in terms of number of ships. The Navy, the US Navy recently put out this very sort of alarmist report saying, oh, China's Navy is bigger than ours now. I mean, look, so is the Iranian Navy and so is the North Korean Navy if you count small enough ships, right? But if you take ships in the at scale and at power, which is usually measured by displacement, then we are still by far and away the larger Navy. We have the larger submarine force. We have more missile capacity than they do, but we patrol globally.
Mm-hmm.
When push comes to shove, they only really need to be able to defend in those waters, you know, a few hundred miles off their coast. We're projecting out 8,000 miles off our coast. That's a very different thing. At the same time, we're still deploying a lot of power into the Atlantic, into the Middle East. So it's not a like for like. It's not a like for like comparison. There's no question that ours is still the more powerful Navy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you run the game, so to speak, if you run the war game in waters close to their shores, I mean, at the very least, they are now a serious peer competitor to the U.S. Navy in the Western Pacific. Beyond that, we still have dominance, but that's even there, they're catching up.
We're down to just a few more minutes. I want to ask a question that is a change of pace, because I think some people may be curious about this, and it gets to the heart of writing the book itself. Somebody asked, what was the most interesting place you visited researching this book, or the place that surprised you the most in what you learned?
Yeah, so I mean, the real answer was probably the Arctic, but since we've covered, I'm going to take you to another place, which is the southern coast of Malaysia. You know, so I boarded what was the world's largest container ship at the time. It's since been outstripped. A container ship that could sail 20,000 plus containers, as much cargo as would be carried by 50 trains with 100 cars each. I mean, just a kind of vast ship. And I boarded it in southern Malaysia. And southern Malaysia is an astonishing place because, of course, it was incredibly remote for a very long period of time. And it's quickly been transformed by sort of Malaysia's Shenzhen, right? So there's this huge buildup. But it is, again, one of these places, you stand on the coast of southern Malaysia, and sort of just over there is the Sembawang Naval Base, where the UK, where the Royal Navy had its base in Singapore, and we now have a base. There's the Horsburgh Lighthouse, which was built by the East English Company at the time of its dominance. You have the modern industrial buildup, this vast presence of China in the commercial real estate sector, and then what is now, I think, the 18th largest shipping base in the world. And so, and at the same time, you can see it's one of the places where the warming seas is rapidly eroding some of the beaches, and you can see just a whisper of our future in terms of the rising seas. So it was a place where you could see past, present, and future all in one locale, and it was a fascinating place to be.
You know, I will apologize to some folks whose questions I won't get to, but I want to, if I can, have the moderator's prerogative of the last question, Bruce, because in some sense, I want to pull together a number of the things you've been talking about tonight. Because one of the things that you do in the book is you look backwards and you look forward into the future. And when you're thinking on that level, I imagine you come to some conclusions yourself about one of the things, you know, that becomes very clear in this book is the degree to which the importance of the oceans runs through every feature of our lives: economic, financial, technological, energy, and personal. I mean, just the nature of how we will live and where we will live. And I wonder what you conclude about our ability to maintain the life that we have now, the life we're accustomed to, and what changes do you think we are going to be forced to adapt to? How will our lives be different, in a sense, from what you've learned over the course of this journey?
Well, I know we're running short of time, but three quick things. One, we touched on, we will deal with a changing climate, sea level rise, and the warming seas, which will have substantial consequences for our weather and how we live on land. I think we have to start to confront this deep tension, as we talked about before, about the kind of closely interconnected economy and the mounting tensions in geopolitics. But the point I try to end with is that although we have to grapple with these, we need a national conversation about these things. We cannot pretend that we're going to be able to retool them at low cost. We cannot pretend that we can maintain the kind of naval dominance we've had, the kind of leadership we've had at low cost. We can't sustain the lifestyles that we've had at low cost without these tensions. And I start the book and I finish the book with this metaphor of a tsunami, where a kind of an earthquake in one ocean and some field over here sort of ripples across an ocean. You don't notice it. It's just a ripple right? But underground, it's building pace until it comes crashing down on some far shore. And I can't escape the feeling that we're at that moment, sort of just before the tsunami. You know how the tide goes out and you watch the tide receding and you know what a tsunami is coming. You can't see it yet. I have this feeling that we're at that point in our history where the vastness of globalization and this huge stakes in the arms race and the kind of contestation with China are going to tear a lot of things apart.
Beautifully put. As you say, you start the book and you end with it. And I want to end today, before I turn it back over to Brad, with doing the thing that you can't do, which is asking people who tuned in tonight to remember to buy this book. Go to Politics and Prose. It's just a marvelous read, and you're going to learn a tremendous amount. And congratulations, Bruce, on getting to the finish line. It's been a pleasure to join you.
Thank you so much for doing this. And thanks again to Brad and to Suzanne Maloney, and particularly you. And while I'm still have a second, I want to have a shout out to Colin Harrison, my editor, who helped make this book actually readable. You know Colin well, so thank you to him as well. So
terrific. Brad, over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Excellent moderating, and thanks for plugging the book for us. And Bruce, you know, it really is so fascinating to focus, as your book does, on how critical the oceans are to so much, you know, whether it's commercial trade or naval arms races, energy development, or climate change. Let's hope your book contributes to a more informed national conversation about the importance of the oceans. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. Reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of To Rule the Waves. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.